My subject of research is the Mapleson cylinders. In brief, the Mapleson cylinders are a series of 128 cylinders recorded live at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City, primarily during the years 1900 to 1904 by the Met's librarian Lionel Mapleson. Containing up to 2 minutes of music, the Mapleson cylinders are highly unique in that they are live recordings, recordings made with full orchestra, and in many instances, recordings of opera singers, conductors who never recorded commercially, such as Jean Doretsky, Milka Ternina, George Anthis, and of particular interest, Emilio De Marchi, who was recorded in excerpts of the role he created, Cavaradossi, in Puccini's Tosca, recorded 3 years after the World Opera's world premiere. The story of the Mapleson Cylinders' accessibility through reissues began in the late 1930s when a number of them were made available through the International Record Collectors Club. Though some had been dispersed, by 1962, all the cylinders were collected by the New York Public Library. In 1985, the library issued a 6 LP set of all the recordings, accompanied by a 72-page booklet. Later this year, the library is planning to make all the cylinders freely available on the web. Despite their relative availability, the cylinders have rarely been the subject of scholarly investigation. Occasionally, when discussing a singer, either in books or CD reissues, an author might momentarily refer to the cylinders, but to my knowledge, no one has attempted a thorough investigation of what can be learned from these unique recordings. The main hurdle to study has been their surface noise, and on some cylinders, a lack of audible signal. In some cases, the noise makes the musical signal all but inaudible. But in many cases, particularly the recordings from 1903, the musical content is quite listenable. I am approaching the Mapleson cylinders as documents to be studied for what they can tell us. On the one hand, there is the musical content, and on the other, I'll call it the extra musical content, which includes what's happening on the stage, in the opera house, and about Mapleson himself as the first notable bootlegger. As far as the musical content, of course, there has long been attention to some of the exceptional cylinders that provide insight into the leading singers of the day. A few of the many examples that have received mention include the aria from Les Huguenots, originally misattributed to Nellie Melba, but much more likely the soprano Suzanne Adams, the final appearances of tenor Jean Doretsky, soprano Lillian Nordica, sounding far better than on any of her commercial recordings, and excerpts of Tosca featuring Emilio De Marchi, who created the role of Cavaradossi and never recorded commercially. Beyond these usual observations, the Mapleson cylinders provoke a number of musical questions. Can we learn anything about the performance practice of the time, or is it too similar to our own that makes comparison superfluous? My contention is that a number of excerpts show performances that vary widely from what we're accustomed to hearing today. Examples include the love duet from La Fille du Régiment, where Donizetti's music is heard with the kind of tempo modifications one expects from a composer like Mahler or Reger. The Act 2 confrontation in Tosca is of significance, if only because of hearing the tenor who created the part. Of the non-vocal excerpts, there's a fragment from The Dance of the Hours from Ponchielli's La Gioconda, in which the violins exhibit very expressive and emphatic portamento. Such excerpts are valuable for what they shed on performance practice or performance possibilities of the time, to adopt an idea based on the writings of Richard Taruskin. Other questions center around Lionel Mapleson's recording activities and what he thought of the results based on what he did with some of them. Why did he record so extensively, and what was their meaning or significance, if any, to him? Based on a few references, we can surmise that Mapleson recorded many more cylinders than the existing 128. As the Met's librarian, Mapleson would have attended virtually every performance at the Opera House, staying until the end to collect and file away the orchestra parts and the conductor's scores. So listening to an opera was far from unusual for Mapleson. In fact, one might assume that at times he might have been bored by it. We know that sometimes on the day following a particular performance, Mapleson would play back his recordings to the soloists who appeared on them. Mapleson recorded not only many excerpts, he occasionally recorded the same excerpts on different occasions. In some cases, we can understand that Mapleson wanted to achieve a semblance of a continuous flow of music with overlapping cylinders, since changing the cylinders takes a good number of seconds to achieve. But in other cases, such as duplicate recordings of choral passages, it's harder to discern a reasoning beyond achieving delight in the novelty of being able to record. While Mapleson kept the existing cylinders, we know that he must have presented some to relatives and friends. In his diary, he describes sailing to England to visit relatives and taking with him over 100 cylinders. Did he leave some of them there? Lacking additional evidence, we'll probably never know, as his close relative died in 1956. We also know that a number of cylinders were found in a second-hand store in Brooklyn. The Mapleson family always lived and continues to live on Long Island, so it's possible to surmise that Mapleson might have presented some cylinders to singers or co-workers at the Met who, after their equipment became obsolete, gave them to a second-hand store. I already mentioned one of the most famous cylinders, the portion of the aria Ase Motusanim from Les Huguenots. Even though some people still believe the singer is Melba, there's really no basis for believing that she is the singer, for she did not sing the role at the time Mapleson was recording. But when we know that Suzanne Adams was one of those who sang the role most often during Mapleson's recording time, and that Adams' husband, Leo Stein, was a close friend of Mapleson, the attribution of that singer to that excerpt becomes not only plausible, but quite logical. Armed with this knowledge, I can hypothesize that some recordings were made and possibly given to singers who were on friendly terms with Mapleson. And then there's the evidence of the cylinders themselves. Mapleson occasionally erased his recordings by shaving the wax down. Sometimes he shaved a single cylinder multiple times. There's a few cylinders which contain 2 different performances, and at least one cylinder that reveals 3 different performances, the result of Mapleson's imperfect ability to shave the cylinder down to complete erasure. Let me skip a little bit in terms of time. Although his live recording ended in the spring of 1903, there are a handful of excerpts recorded in 1904. Perhaps like a typical amateur hobbyist, he really did suffer burnout at the end of the 1902-03 season. There's a series of family recordings beginning in 1909 in which Mapleson commented in his diary, "We got the phonograph working again." The statement might suggest that the machine was damaged and only fixed many years after he ceased recording opera. Further investigation on this point is warranted. Aside from the musical considerations, I want to explore some of the techniques used in the field of sound studies to examine the cylinders from a point of view that goes beyond the musical content. For example, with few exceptions, we know that Mapleson placed his record equipment in the Met's fly system above the stage. Based on the sound of the orchestra, Mapleson positioned his recording apparatus stage left, or from the audience perspective, house right. This is obvious because the recordings always favor the brass and percussion instruments, which in opera orchestras are typically located on the right. Fly systems usually have several rows of catwalks. It's easy to discern that Mapleson must have selected an area upstage, that is, far from the front of the stage. The evidence for this lies in Mapleson's habit of recording choral sequences in operas, such as the choral sequences in Gounod's Faust, Verdi's Aida and Ernani, the little-known opera Ero e Leandro by Met conductor Luigi Mancinelli, and Ignace Paderewski's Monroe. In all of them, the bass voices are the ones most clearly heard, even when they're not the most loudest. In a typical choral placement, the men's voices are usually at the back, suggesting that they were closest to the recording horn. There is also the example of the priestess invocation to Ptah in Aida, Act 1, Scene 2. Usually, the priestess is positioned off stage so that her voice is heard faintly, as if to accentuate the mysterious ritual portrayed in that scene. Ironically, on Mapleson's recording, the priestess comes out loud and clear, also strongly suggesting that the recording apparatus might have been further back, or wherever offstage was, and close proximity to where that priestess was singing. These are some of the pieces of evidence that help us locate Mapleson's preferred recording location. Then there are cylinders, such as the very dramatic excerpts from Tosca, which can be used to discern some idea of stage direction as the singers get closer or further away from the recording horn. Other non-musical issues to consider are reverberation. Often there is none, but occasionally, sometimes a singer points in the direction and you hear the reverberation very clearly. More stage action beyond the Tosca excerpts. Sometimes the recording begins at a logical break in the music, like the beginning or of an aria, and at other times it seems to begin at random. Is it possible to explain why Mapleson chose various beginnings for starting his recording apparatus? Was he aiming for the best parts or beginnings? And then there's the audience. There are times when one hears the audience enthusiastically applauding, and other times when the audience is audible but less enthusiastic. It will be interesting to explore the audience reaction in comparison to our reactions, of course recognizing that we have only a small oral fragment of the multiple senses of what the audience experienced. In closing, my aim is examining these recordings to see not only their musical content and performance practice, but to apply techniques from sound studies to examine their extra musical content, hopefully leading to a new understanding of what we can learn from the Mapleson Cylinders. Thank you.